Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to CannMed 2019. My name is Kyle Boyar. I am the Vice Chair of the American Chemical Society's Cannabis Chemistry Subdivision, and today we're going to be talking about heavy metal contaminants in vaporizer cartridges. I know vape cartridges have really been in the news lately. We're not exactly going to be tackling the cutting agents and diluents, but nevertheless, this is a really important topic that I think we need to explore. I did do this work with Any Afia, who's here in the crowd, with CannaSafe, and so I want to thank them for being so gracious and letting me invade their lab over the weekends. And we also did this in collaboration with Robert Weltman, who's a doctoral student getting his PhD in public health. So with that, I'll dive in. Firstly, do want to give some disclaimers and disclosures. Of course, Any is a principal at CannASafe Analytics, which is a compliance testing laboratory here in Los Angeles, California. And one thing I do really want to stress about this work is that it is done with very limited sample sizes. This is a pilot study and it's ongoing. So really, by no measure should we be taking the data that's presented here and ultimately drawing final conclusions on the subject. So how did it all start? Well, phase 3 compliance testing kicked in on January 1st, 2019 here in California. And that basically mandated that we had to test for the big 4 heavy metals. So that is arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury. And basically here are the different action levels that you see for all the different product types. Of course, you'll notice for the inhaled goods, this is on the lower end of things. We're particularly going to be focusing in on lead today because that is what we're really seeing out there as a problem in the field. So again, it started with this compliance need for people. So they started to, these vape cart manufacturers started to test their cartridges prior to this compliance, this new phase of compliance kicking in. And what the vape cart manufacturers were seeing across the board is most of them were not meeting the mark and they were failing. And we saw a lot of different headlines that were very concerning. Things like lab testing reveals like there's lead in most vape cartridges. And also things like it is worse than reported. So people were really concerned about this, especially the cart manufacturers who couldn't get their products on the shelf. And when we actually asked around for COAs for some of these things, we saw a ton of different results all across the board. So you can notice on the lower end on some of these, lead at 25 parts per million, but you could see almost 11,000 parts per million in some of these. So there's a big question here, and that is, well, is this a big variance in spread that we're seeing across these different cart manufacturers? And then we also got to ask the question about who is doing the testing and how are they doing it, right? Currently, we don't have any reference methods to draw upon to actually standardize the testing of these vaporizer cartridges. So some questions that come to mind is, how are you doing the digestion of these vape cartridges? Are you simply taking the whole cart and running it through digestion fluid and then analyzing? Are you letting your digestion fluid soak into, on the carts and the parts where it's actually having contact? Without knowing what people are doing, really all these results don't have any strong meaning because we can't compare to one another really because everyone's doing something different. This also propagated even further across social media, and that's what really drew our attention is how scared people were about this. Of course, the cart manufacturers, but also the people who are interested in public health and understanding, are my vape cartridges safe for consumption? I do want to give a shout out to a couple different groups that really helped spur this work. California City and County Regulation Watch was really great because it allowed for real-time interaction with those in the community who were dealing with it on the front lines, people whose fingers are on the pulse and they're constantly posting and letting us know what's going on out there. And then also Cannabis Science and Chemistry. I'm a moderator for that group on Facebook. There's a lot of great scientific discourse that's happening online. It's not your traditional forum for scientific discussion, but a lot of really bright folks in there that are bringing some of these topics to light. While not currently engaged in cannabis regulation, the FDA does deal with pre-market tobacco products and different nicotine delivery systems. And you'll notice that there's an overlap in some of the things that we are testing for these. So, of course, the big 4, cadmium and lead would be a part of that. But also they're testing for things like chromium and nickel as well as some of the heating elements associated with nicotine devices also have these involved. And then also, for these devices, it's necessary to conduct analysis of the e-liquids and aerosols in your product due to the substances outlined here that are potentially harmful constituents. And many of these are produced in response to the actual vaping process. So we had some questions to answer in this study, and that is, does storing the cannabinoid-containing solutions that we developed lead to appreciable levels of the big four heavy metals in there? And then if the metals are indeed leaching into the extract, can we quantify that ratio of the big four heavy metals in the pre-vape cartridges to the post-vape cartridges, and then also the condensed material from that vaporization process? And then how does the storage time as well and the residence time inside of these cartridges affect the amount of leaching that occurs during vaporization? And then we also wanted to know, how do the chemical constituents of these different solutions affect the leaching of heavy metals? So to actually answer these questions, we sourced a number of suspected contaminated cartridges out there from a few different manufacturers, and then we filled them with realistic extract solutions containing THC and CBD distillates, terpenes, and various different cutting agents. And then we also ran these through a smoking machine, and we captured the condensate in order to test the concentrations of the metals that could potentially carry over into the end user's lungs. So here are some of the different cutting agents and diluents that you see on the market. So on the left, we've got PG, VG, PEG. I'm sure many of you have heard of these. In the news, in particular, we have the alpha tocopherol and the tocopherol acetate. I think tocopherol acetate is the one we're really concerned about. The alpha tocopherol, someone does have a patent on, and it has been used safely, to my knowledge, out there. But then you've also got things like viscosity by True Terpenes and thickener by Fluoroplex. These are cutting agents and diluents that don't even have ingredients listed, and I think that's certainly going to change here, especially in light of the recent events with all the vaping illness that has been happening. And then what we did use in the study was two different things. So we chose to use medium chain triglycerides, or MCT oil. This is what you commonly see in health food stores, things like Whole Foods. People make their bulletproof coffee with it, but it's also one of the most common cutting agents on the black market currently. And then also we sourced some tech temper from Abstracts. Again, this is another one with proprietary components, but some friends in the vape industry were telling me that this is what's commonly used as a cutting agent for some of these CBD pens, because they're actually not miscible at higher concentrations than the MCT. So for the CBD carts, we used that as well. I also made a terpene blend. We didn't get to do enough of these terpene blends. This is just one of them that I made. I sourced some terpenes from True Terpenes and Fluoroplex, and I essentially copied this formulation that they had online. Why did we choose this one in particular? No particular reason. I just really like terpinolene. It's my favorite terpene. So, but essentially, it's mostly terpinolene with a bunch of other minor components as well. So how did we actually make this smoking machine? So we didn't have any funding, so this was sort of just a fun project that we just decided to investigate further because we were curious about answering these questions. And luckily, Robert, who I collaborated with, is very handy with basically making something like this. So we found something in the literature that would enable us to do this, and we tried to copy it as best we could. So we took a modified aquarium pump and basically flipped the solenoid on it. And then we took an Arduino, which allows us to program the pump that we use so that it would do exactly what we wanted to at the given time points. And then we took a Y-connector adapter and placed it into an Eppendorf tube. And we parafilmed that shut, and then affixed all of this together with a bunch of different tubing, different varieties of tubing. And then we affixed this all to a vape battery with a cartridge attached to it. And so that is a photo there of the actual setup itself. And so here's the smoking machine protocol that we developed. So we programmed the pump to automatically inhale for 12 seconds with 30 seconds of downtime in between the puffs. The battery had an automatic off function after 10 seconds, so we already know that each puff was 10 seconds. That last 2 seconds was used to clear any residual vapor that was left in the tubes. And then we recovered and spun down any remaining oil that was found in the cartridge after the vaporization, and then we also collected the condensate, and then we analyzed all of these according to CannAsafe's SOP for heavy metals analysis. So of course, before we test anything, we want to make sure that everything that we're putting into these carts is clean to begin with and is not going to impact the results. So here are all the different things we sourced to put in here. So we have THC and CBD distillate, the MCT, the Durban poison terps, and the TEC temper. And you can see here that the highest amounts were found in the TEC temper and the THC distillate, but ultimately these are still just at 0.1 part per million. So really, we shouldn't see anything much above that in any of the resulting formulations. So here is the actual sample prep and ICP-MS method that we ran. So digestion, fairly standard. We took our sample and we placed it in a digestion vessel, added 4 mils of nitric acid and then 1 mil of hydrochloric acid. And then we digested this in a milestone ultrawave at 250 C and 120 bar. And as far as the actual method goes, we were calibrated for all 4 analytes across 0 to 50 ppb, 5-point calibration. And then for our different LODs and LOQs, those are all listed there. So between 2 and 30 ppb, depending on the analyte we're talking about. And then as far as the acceptance criteria, the BCC does have these different acceptable ranges of recoveries that you should have for things like your CCVs to ensure the instrument is functioning properly. So 80 to 120% is that acceptable range, and of course your R squared should look good as well and be greater than 0.99. For our pilot data, what we did was we sourced some cartridges from a California manufacturer that this had already basically failed for compliance testing, and they were in quarantine. So by the time we got the stuff, it had already been sitting in the cartridge for 6 months. And we'd already known that it failed compliance, so we had some inkling that there was definitely going to be some metals in there. And as you can see here, over 3 times the action level for lead was found in this particular cartridge. We also ran it through the smoking machine, and we were able to recover very close to the action level of lead, which essentially represents what would end up in the end user's lungs. So that came out at about 480 parts per billion. So the 1-month post-filling data. So here are the different carts that we tested, and you'll notice here that all in yellow, all of the different carts that we tested, not the condensate, but the actual cart itself, what was remaining after the vaping, it all contained near the California action levels. And what was really interesting is for our most interesting data point, we had one in particular that exceeded the California levels by 13 times. Unfortunately, for that particular data point, we weren't able to actually collect enough condensate. We aren't exactly sure what happened, but for that particular one, we removed from our statistical analysis just because it was such a big outlier. And we really don't know if that particular cart just happened to be more contaminated than others. These things are manufactured in China with not a lot of oversight, so the homogeneity between cart to cart may not be all there. So as far as our statistical analysis goes, we did a t-test to compare the different sample means. We basically did see statistically significant differences for most comparisons with the exception of cadmium. And then we also conducted a paired t-test for the condensate versus the remaining oil, and we did see a statistically significant difference for all of the different analytes that we tested for. And then as far as the means go, in our pre-vapor testing, we did show that none of our starting materials contained levels of heavy metals that approached any of the action levels. And then in some of our post-vapor experiments, we saw levels as high as 2 ppm. And then we also saw higher levels in the oil that remained in the cart compared to what was recovered in the condensate by a factor of about 2. And then when comparing all of the post-vapor to the pre-vapor, we see an increase by about a factor of 10. And then when we remove that outlier data point, we see an increase of about by a factor of about 2.5. So as far as the 2-month post-filling data, ultimately what we did see was that levels in all cartridges were on average higher for the 2-month data point in comparison to that 1-month data point. So you can see here, all of these different results suggest that we're definitely over the action level. This one did not, these two did not in particular that are not bolded, but, and ultimately in all of the end products, we did see, or not all the end products, half the end products, we did see that we exceed the action level for at least 2 out of the 4. But ultimately, yeah, all the products contained about a 2 to 8-fold increase in the amounts of lead after about 2 months of sitting in these cartridges. But I do want to give some context for these different data points that we're collecting. So let's consider the 2008 ambient air quality standard for lead. So that's an exposure of about 0.15 micrograms per cubic meter, and that would amount to a dose of about 2.4 micrograms over time. And if you wanted to actually get to those same levels, you would actually have to vape almost 5 of these full gram cartridges in order to achieve that same level of exposure. And then also, in the context of OSHA, the permissible exposure action level is about 30 micrograms per cubic meter. So you get about a mean exposure of 160 micrograms. And basically, you would have to smoke 320 cartridges in a single day in order to hit that level. Now, I think we can all agree that no level of lead is good, right? But we do want to give some context to these numbers just because we don't want to raise the alarm specifically if it's not something that is really overly concerning in a capacity like this. Ultimately, if you were at the permissible exposure limit for OSHA, you would have to smoke over 500 of these cartridges in an 8-hour shift. So I think that would put undergraduate Kyle to shame for sure. So we did have some limitations in the study. This is, again, pilot data. This is by no means perfect, but we did want to get some inklings as to what's going on here. So there's definitely a potential for intra-lot variability between the different brands of cartridges that we tested. Again, China doesn't have the best oversight on some of these manufacturing processes, so you could potentially see one cart that has much more contamination than another, even if they came from the same lot. And then there's also quite a bit of variability in the different types of carts that you see out there. So we tried to do the best we could to mimic what is out there on the market, but you could see anywhere with things with like tons of vitamin E acetate. I mean, we didn't use that as a representation, but that is out there in the marketplace. So we can't take every single cartridge and make something that's realistic, but we can do the best that we can. We did have a lack of replicate samples. Again, we sourced all these carts from just different sources from the internet and friends of ours that are in the industry. So we didn't have a whole lot of these, so we weren't able to do replicates, but that would certainly help in future work. And then also realistic vaping, right? The smoking machine itself is not meant to actually represent the puff topography of what is normally done. We try to take a best representation, but of course, nobody is always hitting a vape pen exactly for 10 seconds, waiting 30 seconds for downtime, and then continuing to puff on. So most people also don't smoke a whole cartridge in a single setting, right? And then also the differences in vaporizer battery settings out there are very wide. So what we did in this particular study was we used an e-cigarette battery that would basically sense the voltage and resistance that is meant for that particular cart type. So we knew that we weren't going to be cooking this stuff, but ultimately, again, this is just one setting, and there are many different settings that you find out there. We only used one standard power rating of 7.4 watts, so at least we could get some consistency across the different samples that we had tested. Some future questions for this work that we have. So the speciation of heavy metals is important. Are these metals that we're seeing there in the inorganic or the organic or inorganic form? Because that's really going to play a factor into how bad this could be for human health. For future work, we also need larger sample sizes. We can't just use a limited sample size and draw conclusions. We'd also like to see some intra-lot variation testing just to see if there is consistency in the manufacturing of these. And then it would be good to also see some different terpene formulations. Like I said, we chose terpinolene dominant simply because that's the terpene of choice for me. But it would be great to see some of these other terpenes, especially I think terpene alcohols would be interesting to see because terpenes, of course, are solvents, and that could certainly impact the leaching of some of these different components into the extract itself. And then we also want to know, do other heavy metals leach aside from the big four? Of course, we're focused on the big four in California because that's what's mandated to be tested for, but do we see anything else like nickel or chromium and things like that as well? Because those could also present some health challenges. And we also want to test more cartridges and formulations sitting in these things after a longer length of time. What I think is interesting in particular with our 2-month data point in particular is that we actually saw a flipping that happened where we saw more of this stuff ending up in the condensate in particular than the actual cart. So that suggests to me, I was actually discussing with Dr. Rogan about this earlier, that suggests to me that, well, if these things are sitting in the cartridge, the actual coil itself, everything is breaking down, right? Because again, terpenes are solvents, some of these cutting agents may be aiding in the breakdown of the metal coil that is inside of these things. So it's interesting to see, and we're curious to test more samples so we can get a better understanding of what exactly is happening here. So in conclusion, we were able to show that a low-cost modified air sampling pump was able to produce condensate that we collected in an Empedorf tube for analysis for heavy metals, and we did recover we recovered remaining solutions, and basically we were able to see that there were elevated concentrations of heavy metals in here compared to the starting materials. And then even without vaping, we still saw that many of these cartridges, 2 out of 4, still exceeded the action level for lead. So ultimately, we still need to do more work on this. This is still very early, but hopefully this paves the way as a cheap and easy way to do this type of analysis so that we can ensure that consumers are safe. With that, I want to thank you all for your time, and I'm open to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Boyar. That was a great presentation, timely and valuable data. 2 questions. One of them might be a little silly. The first one is, Did you notice any organoleptic, visual, or quality differences with the oils that you could kind of see with just your senses that might tip off that they were heavy in metals? I don't know, color, consistency, something like that?
As far as the oils that went in, no, because remember, we tested all these things prior to beginning any work. So we knew right off the bat that the highest levels we would see were 0.1 ppm, and that would be if we had just used pure distillate or the pure TEC temper.
Okay. And the second one is do you have plans to do spiking and recovery data? I think it would help to validate your experimental model, and maybe more people might use it. So just take heavy metal, spike it into samples, and measure that recovery data.
Oh, certainly. Like I said, this is a pilot study. It would be great to actually do some further validation on this method to show that we can actually indeed recover all this stuff. I think that would give researchers a lot more confidence to use this method and move forward with it as a way to do more analysis of this.
Thank you. Good work.
Thank you.
Hi, Kyle. Beth Hayes. I have a question about the thinners and whether some of the thinners might carry more of the lead or break down the metal and release some of the lead than the other thinners.
So I actually think, based on the data that we saw, more of it is actually to do with the terpenes themselves than the cutting agents, although those with just cutting agents and no terpenes still exhibited a significant amount of leaching that had occurred. So I would say that we did see higher levels in the condensate for those with terpenes in particular. So again, terpenes being solvents, I think those are the main contributors, but there's certainly complex chemistry going on here. And based on the data that we have, we can't actually isolate which of these is going to be the greater contributors.
Were there any terpenes that were worse, or you just tested the same terpenes on all, right?
We tested only one terpene formulation, and that was a terpinolene dominant. It would be great to see more work with things like terpene alcohols, because I think those could certainly lead to more leaching in particular.
Yes, please do that.
Yeah, it's coming. It's in the works.
I'm kind of piggybacking on what she said, but in addition to the terpenes, the other additives, you showed MCT and oil and all these other things. Is there any way to test so the patients know that, or the consumer knows that this is going to be clean? Like, are you going to get lead from any of those other things potentially?
Lead is everywhere. Lead at low levels can be everywhere. So ultimately, I think it's best for all manufacturers, whatever they're putting in their products, that they should be testing all the materials, not just the final product, just to know where these sources of contamination could be coming from. Because, like I said, lead is everywhere. So you really have to know your source and ensure that everything that's going into a product for consumption has been tested prior.
So for California regulations, is the company required to test the cartridge with all of these things and they all must pass, or is it just the THC and CBD that has to pass the testing?
It is just the final product. In BCC, for BCC regulations here in California, the final product has to be tested, not the constituents going into it. But of course, some of the more responsible manufacturers may be testing some of the different components prior to it so that they have some indication of what they should see in their end product.
So if there was major lead contamination in the cartridge from something else that was added, a terpene or another additive, that would be showing up in these tests?
Again, this is not mandated for these folks, but I think the more responsible cart manufacturers and producers will be doing this type of testing to ensure that consumers are safe.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question that kind of follows up on what you were saying, that you were talking a lot about, the cartridges are being made in China mostly, and there's not a lot of quality control, and it seems to be influencing the leaching, obviously. And I'm guessing that most of that is coming from the heating mechanism. Is this true, or is it also coming from other parts of the cartridge? And have you compared that to glass cartridges versus plastic? I mean, how far have we been able to get that information?
We haven't been able to test like specific parts of the cartridges. This is just looking at the whole cartridges themselves, and ultimately what's going to cause leaching, I think, is what the actual solution is in contact with, right? But I think it would be great to actually dissect some of these cartridges. You can see some of the folks who did their testing prior to January 1 were actually disassembling the different pieces of the vape cartridges to understand where the contamination was coming from in the cart. But this particular work did not focus on that, but I think future work should take a look at that as well.
And it's not actually the fact that the solution is just sitting, it's that it's sitting in a cartridge, correct?
Yes, exactly, in contact with the components that do have the heavy metal contamination, which leads to this ultimate leaching.
Thank you.
In your view, is there an excipient or diluent that might be better, or I don't know if I want to use the word safer to use in these products, like PG, VG versus MCT oil versus a long chain fatty acid sort of thing?
Ultimately, I don't think we have enough data to make any conclusive statements about what is safe in terms of these different cutting agents. And again, a lot of these things don't even have ingredients lists. So how could you determine that if these things aren't readily made available to the public? So I think that more work needs to be done to establish what kind of cutting agents are actually safe. Any other questions? Thank you.